Hey, I'm Jan Wegener and welcome back to the Early Bird Photo News. After coming back from my 2-week-long Outback road trip last week, it was time this week to sort through the more than 50,000 images that I took. Definitely not an easy task, but it's actually something that I find quite enjoyable and it lets me relive some of my favorite moments from the trip. Unlike many photographers, I don't sort through my images when I'm on the road. I download them from the memory card onto multiple backup SSD drives, but other than that, I basically leave the images alone. Of course, while I'm shooting, I look through the images on the back of the camera to make sure that I capture the right moments, but sorting through the images and picking my favorites is something that I prefer doing at home. After all, these images are the fruits of our hard work in the field and should be something that we look forward to rather than a burden. And I've definitely found that giving me a bit of space between capturing the files and then sorting through them makes it a much more enjoyable process for me personally. I also don't like to delete too many of my images anymore. Hard drive space is very cheap, and so I've become quite lenient when it comes to deleting and keeping certain images. First of all, if you don't delete too aggressively, it's much easier to sort through all the images and you don't have to zoom into every single one, for instance. And secondly, our personal skills, abilities, and preferences will change over time as well. For instance, these days we have much better editing software and noise reduction software available, and hopefully our editing skills have also improved over the last few years. And so whenever I look back at my personal archive, there are certain moments where I regret deleting images in the past. What's your take on the whole situation? Do you actually enjoy looking through your images? Do you find it rewarding, or is it a big burden? Because in the end, I don't think it should be a burden, because ultimately that's what we want as photographers, nice photos, isn't it? So on my recent trip, I took over 50,000 images and still deleted the majority of them, but also kept a few thousand in my archive. Besides sorting through my RAW files, I also had the chance to edit a few images this week, and one in particular stood out to me and basically became an instant favorite. I said for a while that I want to focus more on shots that tell a story and include the environment, and I think this photo in particular embodies that really well. And because I shot this image with the R5 Mark II and it's not cropped, I can now actually crop into the upper left-hand corner and get a second photo out of the same file that still has a long side of more than 4,000 pixels, which is pretty cool, isn't it? The second big target for this trip was another elusive bird, the eastern ground parrot. And as the name suggests, these birds usually live on the ground in dense grassland or swamps, so they're very hard to see as well. When we got there, we were quite lucky and actually encountered a beautiful pair feeding relatively out in the open on our very first evening. We then spent another day there but never saw the birds again. Most of these files were actually quite easy to edit. Only the male ground parrot needed a little bit more love, because that bird was taken in relatively low light and there was a lot of different color casts kicking around in the image. So when editing this image, I had to make sure that I didn't oversaturate the bird, got rid of the magenta cast in the background, and then found a nice overall balance of the whole image. And to do so, I used the hue saturation layer in Photoshop to desaturate the bird a bit, used the color balance layer on the background to give it a bit more green and take out some of the magenta, and then I also used a selective color layer on the yellow channel on the bird and the background to make sure that the colors looked right to me. And then in the end, I think I came up with a quite presentable image. Would you agree? And if you want to learn a fast and efficient workflow that allows you to edit all your RAW files with ease, even the most difficult one, I would highly recommend that you check out my Lightroom and Next Generation Photoshop masterclasses that are linked for you down there in the description. In my classes, I teach you step by step all the important tools and techniques that you need to know in Lightroom and Photoshop to get amazing results from your RAW files every single time. And of course, you won't just be watching, because I'm also sharing my own RAW files with you so you can edit right alongside me. And if you're not sure if my classes are worth it or the right fit for you, check out some of the amazing reviews that I received from many happy students who I've helped to transform their editing lives, who now get great results with ease and actually enjoy the process. So if you want to turn editing from a frustrating chore where you don't really know what photo to pick or what sliders to pull into a rewarding experience where you have an easy to follow workflow and get great results every single time, make sure to check out my classes. I know they will help you a lot. When it comes to photography news and new gear, it has definitely been a bit slow in the last few weeks, but it looks like I have been right again. Because a few weeks ago, before everyone else, I said that Canon is likely not really going to release anything major before Q4 of this year. and very likely in Q4 they're going to be announcing the R6 Mark III. And earlier this year, at the beginning of 2025, I already said that my sources had told me that we'll likely see not any high-end or pro equipment throughout 2025, and that 2026 will actually be the year where we'll start to see some more of those cameras and lenses coming out. And now the sites that were suggesting a release might be more imminent seems to have come to the same conclusion. You just heard it here much earlier. So I expect the next major release to be the R6 Mark III from Canon in Q4 2025. And after that, it's basically anyone's guess. And the biggest question here, I know for many of you guys, is probably where does that leave the R7 Mark II? Now there's a slim chance it could still be released this year, but I think it's more likely it would also be pushed into 2026 and then maybe being released alongside some other lenses. Now I know an upgrade to the R7 would be great, but at the same time, just like with other cameras, I think the longer they can push it out, the better the technology that trickles into this camera might be, which is definitely needed in an R7 Mark II, wouldn't you agree? Speaking of new cameras, one body we will very likely still see in 2025 is the Sony a7 IV. And there have been a few interesting rumors saying that the camera will come with a non-stacked 44 megapixel sensor, have one of their latest AI chips, and also shoot at 20 frames per second. Now, if that all comes true and the camera comes in at a similar price point to the current camera, that would definitely be an amazing camera, very similar to the original Canon R5, but much cheaper. Now, my only question with this rumor would be, is Sony really going to make a new sensor that is non-stacked? When it comes to the price point and image quality, it would probably make a lot of sense, but when it comes to rolling shutter, readout speed, and maybe future-proofing that camera, I'm not so sure anymore if where they would go non-stacked. Nikon recently has also released a whole bunch of firmwares for their cameras, and while most of them only include minor changes, what caught my eye was firmware 3.0 for the Z8. And in particular, there was one new function that could help you with focusing in the field that I found quite interesting. On some big prime lenses, we have a focus limiter that can limit the range in which the camera can focus, but that's not available on all lenses, and on the big lenses, it's also fairly limited. So it's quite interesting to me to see that Nikon actually introduced a focus limiter into their firmware, where you can now go into the menu and then select the focus limiter, which then lets you set a certain distance in between your camera can only focus. So if you're confronted with a scene where your camera constantly jumps onto your background, this new feature can actually stop that from happening. Of course, you need to set it up in a way that you can quickly turn it on and off if you want to focus on something that is a bit further away from you. But I think introducing this feature into your software is actually quite nice, because then you can also use the focus limiter with all kinds of lenses and not just with the big prime lenses like we can do at the moment. The biggest downside I see to this at the moment is that it seems like every time you take your lens off or switch to a teleconverter, for instance, the focus limiter resets. So while that makes sense, it's also something that would be a little bit tedious to set up every single time in the field. So hopefully Nikon can improve on this feature a little bit more going forward. Maybe you can save certain settings for certain lenses, but overall, I think it's a great introduction via firmware. And it's also great to see that Nikon continuously keeps improving their cameras via firmware, something that most other brands don't really seem to do. It's interesting to see that the feature came to the Z8, but seemingly not to Nikon's flagship, the Z9. And that definitely made me start to feel like we're kind of reaching the end of the life cycle for the Z9, and Nikon might be saving up some of these features for the Z9 Mark II. This is also the reason why I think that we won't see any RAW pre-capture introduced in any existing Nikon bodies, because I think this is something that Nikon wants exclusively for their new releases when they come out. The Z9 is still a fantastic camera that captures amazing photos, but at the same time, I think after 4 years on the market, it seems like Nikon is working towards replacing it. Would you agree? Which is actually not a bad thing, because personally I think the Z9 II with RAW pre-capture, higher frames per second, and a lot of other features will actually an amazing camera once it comes out. The biggest dilemma Nikon is actually facing, I think, with the release of the Z9 II is the existence of the Z8 and people expecting the Z8 II to be coming out at some stage as well. Because I can already foresee if I ever do a Nikon Z9 II video, most of the comments will say, this is a great camera, but I will wait for the Z8 II. So I do wonder how the existence of the Z8 and the future Z8 II will actually hurt the release of the Z9 II, because I know a lot of people will probably say, I might just wait, I get a similar camera at a cheaper price. Now, of course, if the Z9 comes out and totally kills it, Zeiss will still be great, but if it's kind of a minor upgrade, maybe similar to the R5 Mark II or the Sony A1 II, I know a lot of people will feel like maybe waiting is the best way to go. Would you agree? Is Nikon kind of in a dilemma, or do you think that the Z9 II will just blow everything out of the water? If you're posting your photos on Instagram like me, you will also be happy that they introduced a few interesting changes. First of all, we can now post larger photos. Instead of 4x5, we can now post 3x4 sized images. And if you do a carousel post with multiple images, they don't have to be the same ratio anymore. You can now have vertical and horizontal in the same carousel, which I also think is a great addition. Now you can think about Instagram what you want, but I think it's still a great place to showcase your photos, and these changes definitely made it easier for us to show them. And if you're not following me on Instagram, make sure to head over there and hit that follow button, and of course also hit the subscribe button under this video. Now that we're heading into July, there's definitely a bit of bad news for us photographers as well, because it seems like that all the major brands have gone through with their price increases in the US, and certain cameras and lenses have definitely taken quite a big hit. For instance, the Sony A1 II now costs $500 more, which is definitely not great for us consumers, and I can only hope that this stays more in the US market and not trickles into all the other markets as well. Now, some of the manufacturers like Canon are also running some cashback discounts and other discounts, so it's kind of difficult to see where the price increases will actually settle in, but it's fair to say that cameras and lenses will definitely be more expensive going forward, at least in the US. One camera in particular that took a huge hit was the R3. It seemed to be selling between the R6 Mark II and the R5 Mark II, but now it actually jumped back up to $5,399 US, very close to actually what an R1 even costs. So that's definitely one camera I wouldn't recommend buying new anymore, simply because the price tag is so big, and then the difference between the R3 and the R1 isn't as big anymore, and then I would always gravitate towards the R1. A few weeks ago, the hottest talk in town was definitely the release of the Sigma 300 to 600mm lens, but since then it has gotten quite quiet. And so I wanted to ask you guys at the end of this video, have you actually gone ahead and purchased a 300 to 600, or do you know anyone who did? Because I would really love to hear some field experiences from people who've used this lens for a longer period of time, because on paper at least it seemed quite heavy and big. So I'd really like to hear how people go with that lens. So please share that with me in the comments, share all your other thoughts about this video in the comments, give me a thumbs up, check out my channel membership and masterclasses, and of course hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you guys in another video very soon. Bye!